Welcome to Aotearoa Tomorrow, a podcast and YouTube channel where we talk about where things in this country are going and what we should be doing about them today. I am your ever-present host, Arthur Falls. Today, we're joined by Max Rashbrook, who's the author or editor of several books on the economic realities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Max is a legend. He's well-versed in most sectors of the economy and tax legislation, and he brings this knowledge to bear on the labour market and economic realities for all Kiwis. This was a really valuable discussion for me, and I'm sure you guys will really enjoy it. Now, Max, you've recently written a book entitled Too Much Money, and this charts essentially wealth and income distribution between New Zealanders and also over time inside Aotearoa, New Zealand. What's the backstory behind the creation of this book? And can you tell us a little about what you discovered while you were writing it?
Well, look, I think the book stems from an interest I've had in the disparities between rich and poor over quite a period of time. I guess ultimately it comes back to my own upbringing, which was a very fortunate one. I grew up in Eastbourne in Wellington, which is one of the wealthier parts of the country, and had a fantastic upbringing. But rapidly became aware as I became a teenager and an adult that lots of people didn't have the same advantages that I'd had, and that a lot of it very simply just came down to money. It's money and income and wealth isn't everything that determines our chances in life, but it's a huge part of it. And if you've got a very unequal distribution of income and wealth, then you're going to have a pretty dysfunctional society, it seems to me, where people have got very different opportunities, and you lose that cohesiveness and that cohesion and that togetherness that makes a country functional. So it felt important to me to chart those dynamics in New Zealand and over time, to look at poverty, but also to look at its counterpart, affluence, and to ask the question, not just do some people not have enough money in New Zealand, which I think pretty evidently is the case, but is that also linked to the fact that perhaps some people have too much money?
It's interesting you raise this point about people potentially having too much money. And the reason I say it's interesting is that I recently downloaded a spreadsheet that had the distributions of wage and salaries across Kiwi earners. And it went back quite some time, maybe to the mid-90s, and carried all the way forward to 2023. And what I noticed was that 42% of Kiwis in 2023 who were working earned less than minimum wage, which to me means at least or something where close to half the population must be working part-time. But what I found particularly disturbing was that almost a quarter of the population was earning about $25,000 a year or less. And this is disturbing for two reasons. I mean, if you want to be kind of dollars and cents about it, it's a huge welfare bill. But also, it makes me wonder when they say we have such low unemployment, how true is that statement when so many people obviously are not earning enough to actually get by and don't have employment, are not fully employed?
Yeah, look, I think those are all really valid points. And there's so many different elements, I think, that go into really low incomes at the lower end of the scale. Firstly, I mean, you do have the people who are unemployed. In the formal measure, that's about 4% of the population. But obviously, what that doesn't really capture is people who, are in work but are working far fewer hours than they would like. And it often doesn't count the people who've become so discouraged that they're not even looking for work, because you basically have to be looking for work to turn up in the unemployment statistics. So there's another measure that's called underutilization, and that's sort of separate and on top of the unemployment figures. And I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head, but it's very significant. I mean, it can be as much, again, as the pure unemployment figures. And then, yes, you've got lots of people who are working part time. Some of them are happy to be part time, but a lot of them would like more hours if they could get it. A lot of those jobs are very poorly paid. There's a lot of people in precarious work, so jobs where you don't have any job security, the gig economy, driving for Uber, being a courier driver, that kind of thing, where your income and your hours might change day to day, week to week, and you've got very little control over that. And so all that adds up to, some incredibly low incomes at the bottom end of the scale. And then you've got everyone who's on benefits, of course, and the core unemployment benefit, although it increased a lot under the Labour government, is still only $340 a week. So there's a lot of New Zealanders trying to get by on some very low incomes.
The way you say that underutilization can be as high as unemployment. I mean, right now, so we've got 4 or 5% unemployment. That's, say, 250,000 people. On top of that, you're adding another 100,000 who are just out of the workforce, out of either choice or despair, but certainly not earning an income at all. And then you've got, so let's call that 8%. And then you've got, that actually brings you up to 40% to 50% of the potential workforce, working age population, that are living on less than minimum wage, because you've already got 42% that are living on less than minimum wage. And this bespeaks to me essentially a nation that is actually quite poverty stricken.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've been a low wage economy for a long period of time. I mean, you have to be careful about all the statistics. I mean, it's not always the case that the underutilization rate is the same as the unemployment rate, but it can be in the same ballpark. The other thing is that all this data we are looking at is by individuals, and of course, individuals live in households, and a lot of those people who are themselves earning below minimum wage will be in households with people who are earning above minimum wage. So the classic sort of 1.5 earner type family. So if you look at it from a household point of view, it's not quite as grim, I think, as those statistics might suggest. But yes, but it is absolutely true that over the last 30 to 40 years, New Zealand has become a very low wage economy. And that's because when we economically restructured in the 1980s, we got out of the things that tend to drive higher wages, and that's manufacturing and things like that. And there might have been some good reasons for that, because a lot of those industries in New Zealand were very sheltered. They were sort of overprotected from competition. But we decimated manufacturing and our relatively sort of high skill sectors. And mostly what we replaced that with is poorly paid service jobs. And at the same time, we kind of very heavily damaged the bargaining power of frontline workers, your average sort of wage and salary earners. So we've shifted to an economic model where, firstly, we're just not generating that much wealth. We're not doing high tech, high value, high skill stuff for the most part. We're sort of lots of low paid service sector jobs where, exporting milk powder to China, we're cutting down trees and just chipping them out as raw logs. So there's not that much value and that much sort of wealth in the first place. And then to the extent that we are generating that wealth, very little of it is actually going to the people who work on the front lines. A disproportionate amount of it is being taken by the people at the top of the tree, the company owners and the investors and the like, whose incomes and whose returns have increased massively in the last 30 to 40 years.
So that talks about people at the top of the tree, but there's this massive chunk of New Zealand, farmers, orchardists, agriculturalists and horticulturalists in general, who I think if they heard us having this conversation would say, well, look, sure, maybe Labour has lost its ability to collectively negotiate, but frankly, we can't afford minimum wage as it stands. And a lot of these people in primary production, certainly the ones that I meet, describe industries that are really not able to function even at current wage levels, which themselves are far below what we would consider a living wage.
Well, look, yes, I mean, and that is a problem that economies face. But look, even though it's a very harsh conversation to have with people, you do have to raise the question: if your business isn't generating enough revenue to pay New Zealand's minimum wage, which, bear in mind, is about $22 an hour, it's hardly extortionate. You do have to raise the question: do you have a viable business? Because you think about, if you take that logic to its sort of, its furthest extension, you wouldn't have a minimum wage at all, and you would just allow businesses to pay whatever pittance they wanted, $10 an hour or something, absolute bare minimum subsistence. The reality is that work, if businesses are to be viable, if work is to mean something, they have to be able to pay people good wages. They have to be living wages, wages on which people can live. And if they aren't able to pay that, then yes, it's a harsh conversation. But the approach that the Scandinavians take, with their very, very high wages, is to say that if businesses can't afford to pay these wages, then yes, some of them will go out of business, out of operation. But that will then free up capital, free up investment, which can flow into the businesses that do have a business model where they can pay people those higher salaries and make it work. And although that's very disruptive and very painful for individual businesses, you never want to understate that, it works out for the benefit of the country as a whole. And that's actually, and it's a spur to innovation, because you have to be doing something quite innovative, something high value, in order to deliver those higher salaries.
Well, that's all well and good, and I like the sentiment, and it makes sense, certainly from a market-driven perspective. But I feel like if that starts knocking off entire industries, the horticulture sector, for example, it's been smashed by Gabrielle and already was struggling for a range of reasons. I mean, it puts us between a rock and a hard place where we have these potentially entire industries that can't afford to pay more, export oriented industries that can't afford to pay their workers more because the world price for their goods just simply isn't there. But there doesn't seem to be, to talk about moving capital, how do you move an entire, you can't move an entire industry or repurpose all of the resources of an industry if it has to be abandoned, right? And I feel like with the speed at which the global economy moves, we can find ourselves in a position where entire sectors of the economy are just teetering on the edge and really we need them to even maintain the jobs that we have, low paid or otherwise. So I get what you're saying, but I still feel for primary producers, certainly smaller scale primary producers. And when I say smaller scale, I'm still talking massive scale. I'm just not talking, I'm not talking 25,000 acre farms. I'm talking about 1,000 acre farms that are still very large, but or orchards for that matter. But for those people, it feels like increasing the minimum wage really could be risking entire sectors of our labor economy as it stands. I'm not a big fan of ACT, right? But when I hear them make their calls against things like minimum wages and minimum wage increases, and railing against concepts like the living wage, this is the truth in their words that I kind of hear, that some of our industries are actually so on the ropes that regardless of what the workers need, these industries themselves are in a precarious position.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are some valid concerns there, but I think there's a number of points that it's important to remember. The first is there's actually not much evidence that raising minimum wages, certainly at the levels we're talking about, leads to job cuts. That's a common assumption, and sort of probably 20, 30 years ago was economic orthodoxy. But I mean, and obviously, if you raised the minimum wage to $50 overnight, then you'd see huge job losses. But actually, at the rates we're talking about, even New Zealand's minimum wage, which was one of the higher ones in the world, compared to as a proportion of our average wage, when you look at the data, actually, there's not much evidence that they lead to job cuts. Partly because when you pay people better, they actually tend to work harder. They tend to turn up on time more often, they tend to quit less often. So there's productivity benefits just from paying people better at the lower end. The second thing I would say is that minimum wages are a blunt instrument. And in New Zealand, we probably do rely a bit too much on the minimum wage. Other countries which have very high wages don't actually often rely hugely on the minimum wage necessarily. In fact, some of them don't even have one. But they ensure much higher wages through much stronger bargaining power for workers, which means much stronger trade unions, basically. And that's traditionally been the Scandinavian way and the German way. And the advantage of that is that when you're bargaining with staff, you can be a bit more flexible according to what's going on in that individual business. So businesses where the staff know that the business is struggling might be a bit more tempered in their demands, whereas if things are really going great guns, then the workers can demand a bigger share of that pie. So, I do want to see wages raised at the bottom. I think it's hugely important. But I don't actually think we have to do all of that through the minimum wage. I think a lot of it is about more flexible bargaining, which is what things like fair pay agreements were going to achieve. The last thing I'd say is that ultimately, though, New Zealand needs to move into higher value sectors or higher value products within the existing sectors, because those horticultural businesses that you're talking about, we have known for years, for decades probably, that we can't just keep extracting things, digging up things, producing pretty basic raw things and just sending them off overseas for someone else to add the value to them. We need to get those businesses in a position where they are doing high value, high export, high wage stuff so that they can afford to pay their workers better. And that's about transforming the way we do industry. It's about, I think, greater government investment. It's about greater investment in research and development, which we do very poorly as a country. We actually need to shift ourselves onto a higher wage, higher skill, higher value path.
It's interesting you say all that because, National came in promising more innovation, higher paying jobs, etc. The only sector that I can see that can do that is manufacturing. It employs about 10% of the workforce currently. And certainly and it does about half or 60% of our actual research. So all R&D, 60% of it's done by 10% of our by the industry that employs 10% of our workers, which is manufacturing. So this is all slotting into exactly what we're talking about. Specifically in production of machinery and the production of tooling for machinery, I think that accounts for about 25%, maybe 1% or 2% of our workforce, but 25% of our R&D. And so when National talked about increasing high-paying jobs, I expected to see them pushing for more manufacturing and specifically tooling or an expansion of our tooling industry. But whatever that is, I know nothing about the industry. I just see it. I just see it as a line item on the statistics. But I haven't heard anything in the media that led me to believe that they were even thinking in that direction. The only thing I've really seen them doing is talking about mining, and that takes us right back to what we're just talking about, which is this extractive economy that doesn't produce value-added goods, and essentially sends it doesn't require any high-skilled workers or few high-skilled workers. Predominantly, it's crew by the willing, long hours, hard work, and low pay.
Yeah, and look, and I think in some respects it's even worse than that, because you look at the tax changes that the new government has made. There's a $2.9 billion tax cut for landlords, so encouraging investment in rental property. So something that doesn't do in New Zealand any export revenue at all, doesn't help us pay our way in the world in the slightest. And that's had a fair bit of attention. But what's had less attention is that they're actually going to make it harder for commercial landlords, so people who are renting properties to businesses, to deduct certain expenses. It's going to cost commercial landlords in the order of $500 million a year, I think. So they're sort of actually tilting the scale towards investing in rental property and away from, actual sort of productive businesses that might be generating export revenue. So if anything, they're heading in the wrong direction on that. And more broadly, I see no intent to address the really big problems that we have, which is, like I said, the underinvestment in research and development. There are really successful countries out there which are probably investing twice what we do in R&D as a percentage of GDP. We don't invest in it very well as a government, and our New Zealand businesses actually invest relatively little in R&D compared to their overseas counterparts. I also think we don't really have a clear sort of sense of our mission as a country or as an economy. What are the big picture things that we want to solve? Do we want to be big in GM or biotech? Do we want to be world leaders in the technology for climate adaptation or climate mitigation? What are the really big picture missions we want to follow? That sort of stuff has to be set at a national level by government, and I don't really get any sense from this government, or indeed really from previous governments, of what those missions might be.
Yeah, because Rocket Lab just moved overseas. They've moved almost all of their operations to the US, and I had a look at their backing. The investors that they had, and it was the ACC fund and one fund from Auckland, and one investment from Auckland, and the idea that there's no money. This is a major Kiwi success story, and it wasn't funded at all by New Zealand. It was all funded overseas, and then it went overseas. And all of those highly paid jobs and highly skilled jobs and all that R&D, which actually probably would have, if Rocket Lab was still here, probably would have doubled our national R&D output. But that's all gone to the US. And I was trying to figure out why there was no money for this kind of business coming from New Zealand. And like you say, it's got to be the housing market. It's got to be the pipeline for capital that has been set up to funnel money into housing via low interest rates, the pipeline created for lending money for real estate transactions, and then also the exemption of real estate from capital gains tax. That is another conversation that we do not need to get into. But it does seem like the real estate market is sucking up all of the capital that we need to develop manufacturing capacity.
Yeah, and you could really, and I mean, one really great example of that that we saw through the pandemic is when the government put a lot of effort into basically making it easier for banks to lend money because they were worried about the economy collapsing and they wanted, funds to flow through to companies. And the banks took that cheap finance, made cheaper by the actions of the Reserve Bank, and poured a huge amount of it into the housing market. And so we had this, as everyone knows, this colossal inflation of the housing market, this incredible housing bubble. And so, there's a lot of different things that are in play. I mean, there is all the tax stuff. You're quite right. I mean, well, the fact we don't really have a capital gains tax at all, is a big problem. But it's also things like the actions of banks. Banks are falling over themselves to lend money, on real estate, much less interested in lending money to, actual sort of export-oriented businesses. Now, up to a point, this is understandable because lending on housing is generally incredibly safe, but it's still a massive problem. That allocation of capital by banks is a big part of the house price story. It doesn't get enough attention, but if there wasn't such a colossal amount of money sloshing around ready to be lent on houses, then house prices wouldn't be as inflated as they are. And at the same time, that's starving actually export-oriented businesses of some of the funding that they need. And so all these problems, I think, are intertwined.
I guess what we're talking about is the demand drivers for labor. We've got a lot of demand for low wage labor in the economy, and we've got very little demand for higher wage, higher skilled labor. And that is driven by, or that under demand is driven by a very small manufacturing sector, right? We've got a bunch in the service industry, a whole bunch of stuff in primary production, but just very, very little in actual manufacturing. How did we get here, though? It's been, I mean, this is a leading question, and I know where this is going to go. But we've known we've had an issue for a really long time, and like you said, it really began with the restructuring of the economy in 1984. But what was it about that set up that restructuring that set up New Zealand to be the way it is today?
Well, in a sense, I think you could say that the problems go back further than that because yes, New Zealand did have an incredible standard of living, one of the highest in the world. In the 60s, and and that's part of our national. Well, it's a sort of a true part of our national folklore, if you like. But even then, we weren't necessarily doing a huge amount of stuff that was really sophisticated. We just happened to have, large and generous markets for our primary produce. I mean, famously, we shipped a huge amount of stuff to the UK. Our beef and sheep exports and all the rest of it, and they took it all these wonderful prices. I mean, and in truth, things were already were starting to decline at that point. But certainly then, when Britain ironically went into the EU, into the European community in the early 70s, and suddenly we lost, a huge amount of that export market. We really started to struggle, and we discovered that we'd been overly reliant on just, shipping this primary produce halfway across the world. The response then in the 1980s, of course, didn't make things better because basically, we deregulated and we swept away sort of the import tariffs that had protected New Zealand manufacturing so rapidly and so abruptly, and we slashed employment in the state-owned enterprises so rapidly and so abruptly that tens of thousands of people were just chucked on the scrap heap, basically. And there's communities like Tokoroa and Kawerau which, have probably never recovered from the loss of those dominant industries, or Pororua, which a lot of the people living there were employed in the Todd motor factory that assembled cars. And when that suddenly went overnight, there was no help for people. There was no support through the transition. There wasn't what we needed, which was a huge retraining and skills program to take people whose skills had been made redundant and to fit them for work in the late 20th century. And I think that sort of still, bedevils us. I mean, what Longy and Co. brought in the 1980s was this, sort of market fundamentalist, hyper-individualistic, government hands-off kind of approach that said, if government steps away from the picture, the market will just sort everything out. And of course, that's fundamentally not true. Markets, if they're going to function well, rely on huge amounts of government effort and support, and actually government providing the foundation of private prosperity, which is what the National Party ironically used to say in the 1960s. So we haven't invested enough in things like R&D. And I keep coming back to that because it's such a basic example of the stuff that government does. But we don't invest very well in skills and training either. You said that there isn't sort of that much demand for high-skilled labour, and that's true up to a point. But actually there is some. There are businesses out there that are crying out for highly skilled workers, and they just don't seem to be able to find them partly because we do such a bad job of vocational training in this country. It's got a little bit better recently with mana and mahi and apprenticeships and, free trades training. But that's yet another thing that, that people didn't seem to realize in the 80s is you need all these public investments. You need all these public supports for markets to function properly. And so we do a very poor job of training up people for high-skilled trades. We also have, so basically 1 child in 10 living in poverty. And those are children who aren't going to go on generally and fulfill their potential. They are very unlikely to be productive members of the workforce. So there's all this wasted talent, and we don't do a very good job collectively in investing in that talent. And that's, it's a very long legacy, but it's partly the legacy of the 80s and 90s, this idea that you just get out of the way of markets, things will function brilliantly. And what we've been finding out for the last 30 or 40 years is that's just not true.
We've spoken a lot. We've spent this time speaking about what's wrong with the labour market. But obviously, some people in New Zealand are making a ton of money. From my understanding, 10% of the population has 90% of the money. What are they doing? How are they getting all of that cash when the people who are actually working aren't able to get their hands on any of it?
Yeah, well, it depends a bit if you look at sort of on income or on wealth. But certainly, if you look at wealth, what people own, so who owns the New Zealand economy and things more generally, the wealthiest 1% probably own a quarter of the entire country. So that's 40,000 people who own a quarter of, all the wealth that's out there in New Zealand. And the 10% more generally probably own 70% of all the wealth in the country. So huge, huge inequalities of wealth, and yeah, very little left for other people. Um, and what's going on there? If you look at the very wealthiest New Zealanders who were the subject of a big inland revenue report last year, you look at sort of the 300 or so wealthy families, their worth, their wealth is, in the order of 80, 90, $100 billion between them. They're extremely wealthy. A lot of those fortunes, a lot of the people on the NBR rich list have made their money in what's called the FIRE economy. So that's finance, insurance, and real estate. So, not things that are entirely unproductive necessarily, but, industries that to some extent are parasitic or exploitative or, simply involve vast amounts of money going into investment property to no real benefit to the country. Yes, there are some manufacturing fortunes. There are some genuine innovators and entrepreneurs in there, but there's also a lot of, frankly, not very dynamic or exciting wealth. And what we know, so there are huge returns, obviously, on those activities, and not an awful lot of tax being paid. So we know from that study of New Zealand 300 wealthiest families that people are typically paying about 9% of their economic income in tax. So a tax rate of about 9%, which is less than the tax rate paid by someone who stacks shelves in a supermarket. And that is for a number of reasons, but one big reason is that at the upper end, people don't generally make their money through wages and salaries. They make it through buying and selling things. They make it through capital gains, in other words, and capital gains for the most part are untaxed. And if we had a proper capital gains tax, it could bring in something in the order of $4 or $5 billion a year. And so that gives you a sense of the scale of the income at that upper end that just isn't being taxed at all at the moment.
And I suppose that's 4 or 5 billion a year after all of the optimizations that high net worth individuals have at their disposal in the form of, nested companies, trusts, and the rest of it. Why don't we have? I mean, our tax system is super simple, right? It's all just income, and if you buy something for its use value, that is income tax exempt if it goes up in value, right? So that's why if you live in a house, right, you bought it for its use value. So if it goes up in value when you sell it, that's okay. You can go and you don't have to pay tax on that. And it actually makes sense on owner-occupied houses because you're going to have to buy a new house in the same market. So you're going to wind up selling your house and you're going to need the same, whatever you earn from it, whatever price it got up to, you're going to have to spend that again. And that makes sense. But it gets used for second houses. It gets used for investment properties. It gets used for shares. The idea that, people don't talk about how much money they made when they buy shares in the annual dividend from companies. They talk, you see on the news relentlessly, it's all about how much those companies have gone up in value. And so it seems to me there's almost a willful misapplication of the tax law to these sources of income. And that being the case, because it seems so brazen and so baldly obvious, why isn't anyone doing anything about it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that New Zealand has had a very different tax system in the past, and we tend to forget that. Um, for a century, from the 1890s onwards, we had an estate tax, an inheritance tax, if you like, and but it got sort of eroded progressively, mostly through the use of trusts, and of course that's a whole nother discussion. But so people found ways of avoiding, paying inheritance taxes basically by routing stuff through trusts. But nonetheless, we had an inheritance tax, for a century or so. We also had much higher income tax rates. Prior to the 1980s, the top income tax rate was over 60%. So things have been and they can be very different. I think the reason we don't have a capital gains tax is inevitably complicated, and it's partly because we've just had a very strong anti-tax mantra for the last 30 to 40 years. But I think, and these things are probably sort of symbiotic, uh, I think we have an economy that is unusually reliant on selling things for an untaxed capital gain, sort of at the end of your economic or working life. So we're not very good, as we've already discussed, at creating businesses that actually generate a lot of revenue in the present moment by producing really innovative and exciting and dynamic products that people want to buy. If you think about a couple of the dominant sort of sectors or activities in New Zealand life, farming and property investment, often neither of those things actually brings you a lot of money in day to day. Even a lot of farmers, a lot of big farmers aren't always, some of them are, but a lot of them aren't actually creaming it in the moment. What that business model is very reliant on is selling up at the end, after 20, 30 years of owning your farm or indeed owning your rental property, selling up, cashing in, and getting a huge payout that you don't pay tax on. Now, I mean, of course, that's true in any economy, but I think the New Zealand economy is particularly reliant on those tax-free capital gains. And so that's created a sort of structural obstacle, I think, and it means people aren't very willing to recognize a very basic fact, which is that income is income. My salary, my wages are income, and I pay tax on it. The profit you make selling an asset, be it a house or a farm, is also income, and you should be paying tax on that. We should treat those things equally and fairly. That's not very complicated in a conceptual sense, but there are these structural and sort of power-based reasons for people not to listen to that argument.
Do you know Tomlin, who used to live at the moorings?
Yes.
I was having a chat with him in Wellington a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying exactly what you've just said. But his view, and this is funny to be bringing up the point of just a random mate in Wellington, but his view was that we actually have an entrenched culture of making money this way. You graft away on a farm, use the earnings to pay the mortgage, and then sell the farm, and there's your retirement or your inheritance for your kids or whatever, or chuck it in a trust, whatever you do. But this has been the model for so long that we've internalized this institutionally at the level of the IRD and the government itself, but also culturally, we've come to see that as the way you make money. And it goes back hundreds of years, goes back 100 years. And this is part of the hurdle that we need to somehow overcome, is update our ideas of how money is made for a day and age where, unfortunately, there is no house or farm to sell at the end of a life. It's a wage job, probably for not a very high income, that a person has to do until they reach retirement or move to Australia.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating is all these things that we're talking about are interconnected, and you start to see the connections, right? You've got the structural sort of dependence on untaxed capital gains. Why do you have that? Well, because you're not producing that much money day to day necessarily. Why is that? Well, that's back on the fact that you're in a business that's not actually that productive. It's not that innovative. It's not generating the higher wages. So that brings us back to the first part of the conversation. And then you could add in another element, which is also why are people so obsessed with investing in property for their retirement? You know, I wrote a column once saying that house prices need to come down by 40% for them to become affordable once more. And in response, someone said, "Oh, I really feel like this is attacking the New Zealand dream of one home to live in and one home for your retirement property." And I thought, when did that become the New Zealand dream? You know, that's so, because that's not supposed to be the New Zealand dream. It's supposed to be you can own a house. That's it. You know, but people are obsessed. They're very reliant on investment property for their retirement income. Already some people are, the 10% of New Zealanders who are landlords and who are very vocal about it. And I think that's in part because other forms of investment, you know, like investing in sort of, you know, high-tech New Zealand startups or whatever. I mean, A, there aren't that many opportunities because we don't have that many of them. And B, it seems quite risky. And C, people have got long memories of things like the share market collapse in 87 because, you know, New Zealand's share market was very poorly regulated, or the finance company collapses in the 2000s because the finance companies were very poorly regulated. And so in a sense, you know, these sort of problems with the structural reliance on an investment property actually reach back all the way into government inaction, the failure to regulate other places you might put your money, and that which is what makes putting your money into property look incredibly safe. So all these things are connected in very, very complicated ways, and it's quite hard to break out of that trap. And so you end up where New Zealand is, sort of stuck in a low value, low skills, relatively low tax, certainly very low taxation of wealth and capital dynamic. And because all the bits are connected, you know, it's harder to get people to accept capital gains tax before their businesses are more productive, but it's hard to make their businesses more productive without the R&D investment that you would probably fund through a capital gains tax, some of it anyway. You start to see why we are where we are.
So, what would you change?
Oh, well, lots of things. Um, I think I think fundamentally we need a change from what I would describe as an extractive economy to an inclusive one. With sort of slightly woolly terms, but basically extraction in the sense of digging stuff up out of the ground, cutting down trees and just sending them, you know, overseas for other people to do more interesting things. With you know, owners of firms extracting an awful lot of money and value out of their staff without really paying them for it. Um, you know, landlords extracting money from renters, and just generally us extracting a lot from the future. You know, we're kind of beggaring our future selves by not investing now. And we need to move to an economy where where it's inclusive, we're trying to create growth that's widely shared, and we're investing uh, in our human capital, we're investing in people's potential. And if you know, if I had to make that more concrete, I think it's the last point. You know, I think too many businesses and to some extent too many politicians, our governments generally see workers and salaries as a cost, you know, as something that you try to minimize rather than regarding people as an asset. So, you know, from the very early ages, we don't invest enough in reducing or eliminating child poverty to ensure that, you know, we've got lots of productive workers in future. We don't invest in vocational training particularly well. We don't invest in retraining beneficiaries. Countries like Denmark spend the equivalent of probably billions of dollars a year on what are called active labour market programs, basically really good skills and retraining programs for people who are unemployed. I don't think our businesses invest a lot in their staff. You know, I don't think there's nearly enough sort of on-the-job training being carried out by employers. And we don't invest very well for the long term as a country. You know, we don't invest in the infrastructure that we're going to need in future. We don't really have the equivalent of the sovereign wealth funds that invest in the future for other countries, although the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, the Cullen Fund, could play that kind of role. So I think it's fundamentally, rather than sort of extracting stuff and sort of sweating assets and things, we actually need a culture of long-term building up investments in people and in physical infrastructure. The problem is that that's not really a mindset. New Zealand, I think, is a very short-termist country, and that's quite a big mindset shift that we need. And it's easy to say, but it's quite hard to do.
So, policy-wise, specifically, what would you hope to see in the next election? Well, let's make it simple. What would you change right now as far as a policy? What is there anything you would advocate for in the short term that you feel like is within the Overton window?
Well, I mean, what's sort of politically possible is always, is always fungible and changeable. And look, I'm not sort of super optimistic that this government is going to take a lot of steps in the direction I've outlined, because, like I said, at the moment, they seem to be making it easier for landlords, for property investors, and harder for commercial property owners. But look, I mean, I would hope at least that we maintain a decent minimum wage. I would hope that we invest more in retraining programs for beneficiaries. This government is very focused, as you probably would have gathered, on getting people off welfare and into work, which I think is an absolutely legitimate goal for a lot of people, for people for whom paid work is the right option. But I think people need a lot of support to get there, because often they just don't have the skills that they need at the moment. So I would like to think that this government is open to investing in those kinds of skills and retraining programs. I think that's probably the best bet. And there might be a conversation to be had about research and development as well, because, that's a relatively business-focused thing. I'd hope that the government would see the logic in increasing our investment in R&D, because that's what's going to pay off in the long run.
Well, thanks, Max. This has been insightful. It's covered a whole bunch of areas that I really wanted to get through, and more actually, and in pretty good time. Is there anything else you feel like is worth adding to this conversation?
I guess one other thing was sort of touched on but not really discussed in any depth is that, a lot of this comes down to people's conditions of work and the power balance in the workplace. And with over time, New Zealand having gone from a situation where 60-70% of people were represented by a trade union to under 20% now, the bargaining power of the average worker is much, much lower than it was. And so it's unsurprising that wages, remain as low as they are. If working people had kept the proportion of company revenue that they enjoyed in the 1980s, the average wage would be probably $14,000 a year higher than it is right now. And that's $14,000 a year basically that's going to business owners, so capital, banks and people who provide equity stakes and shareholders, rather than to the people on the front line who are actually doing the work that the company relies on. So there's been these big shifts in power in the New Zealand economy in the last 30 to 40 years. And without changing those, it's hard to really significantly increase wages at the bottom and get to a situation where work really is paying for people and everyone who's working can enjoy, the rudiments of a decent life.
And this is unions, right? This is the way that works. But I actually had an unasked question about this. And that was, so you get these unions. I always think of unions as these massive, ungainly organizations that put workers in the position of having to play ball with this industry-wide approach to employment. So, for example, we talked about if you've got an individual business that is struggling, then if the workers can accept that, see this thing is struggling, and there is not going to be much of a job left for them if they demand higher wages, well, then that's quite helpful, right? I mean, that's that tight coupling of the relationship between the employer and the employee. But if those employees are members of an industry union, then their hands may be tied and that business may find itself going under. And those employees find themselves without a job. And then if the union can provide for that in some way, then that's great, and I'm sure that's probably one of the services you'd hope that a union would provide as some kind of income protection in addition to the unemployment benefit. But but yeah, I just wonder, doesn't that put us in a position where there can be significant collateral damage from having these industry-wide, potentially collective bargaining powers?
No, I don't. I don't think so, because I think actually unions are associated with the greatest economic growth and the most evenly distributed economic growth that the world has ever seen. You look at that period, or I should say the world, I should say the West, and certainly the Anglo-Saxon countries. You look at those years between 1950 and 1980, what the French call les Trente Glorieuses, the glorious 30. Incredible, certainly in the West, incredible rates of economic growth, and very sharply declining inequality. So periods where there was lots of economic growth around, and it was going to the people at the bottom and the middle, the people who needed it most. That is the period of the great flourishing of trade unions. That was when trade unions, were at their height. And so actually, and there's plenty of evidence that backs this up. Generally more equal societies have stronger growth rates because everyone's involved, everyone's included, everyone's benefiting from the prosperity, and so they're much more productive workers. And trade unions are a huge part of that story of greater equality. And look, and you have to have those forces, because otherwise, your workforce is sure a few people at the top, some independent consultants who don't need a union, their skills are in massive demand, they'll be fine whatever happens. But for the vast majority of people, without some kind of organization, some kind of institution, some kind of force backing them up, they are much, much less powerful than their employer is, and they will be in real trouble if they don't have a union or something like that backing them up. And we see this post 1991, post the Employment Contracts Act, which really struck at people's bargaining power. Pay rates fell almost overnight. There were huge declines in the pay going to people who worked in supermarkets, for instance, and other people who worked in retail, people who worked in hospitality. Because, as soon as people lost that bargaining power, as soon as employers realized that they had the upper hand, they were pretty ruthless in actually driving people's pay rates down. And so that's why you really need strong institutions, strong unions backing up the vast majority of the workforce if they're going to get a reasonable share of the revenue that their company is generating.
It's interesting because all of those industries you just described are service sector industries, right? So those are already I mean, that's 70% of the economy. So naturally, you'd 75%. Naturally, you'd expect it to be those, but that is where I suppose the pressure has been laid, because those people are fungible effectively.
Yeah, but I mean, just because there's other people who could do the job, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be paid well to do it. It's still a necessary job, right? And I'd make the same argument about cleaners. We need cleaners, at least until the robots, replace them. And while people are doing a job that's necessary, they should be paid enough for a good life. It's as simple as that.
Well, that's a great spot to end it on. So thanks so much, Max. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll put a picture of your book up on one side of of the video there, and I'd suggest everyone check it out. Max Rashbrook, Too Much Money. I have actually read the book, which it was long, but it's not actually that long, and it had lots of pictures, and so it was, for me to read a book is saying something. So. Yeah, I appreciate it, and thanks for joining me, Max.
No problem. Thanks very much.
What a guy. So just some, no right of reply comments on that chat. Loved it. Love what Max had to say. Really thorough. But I feel like his response that raising minimum wages has not been demonstrated to reduce employment misses the reality of our nation's weak horticulture sector and the notion that collapse of that industrial sector would free up capital for investment elsewhere is a very academic mindset that is actually detached from reality. The data does support Max's position over those who say that increasing the minimum wage reduces job numbers. That's people like David Seymour, who dishonestly promote the opposite perspective in public when arguing against the minimum wage. What both sides of the debate miss, although it's not really a genuine debate, increasing minimum wages doesn't cause an increase in unemployment in a healthy economy. That's an established fact. But in an unhealthy economy, where some industries are on the verge of collapse, artificial intervention in the form of minimum wages or other ones, but we're talking about minimum wages here, could push them over a cliff, leading to mass job cuts when the entire sector becomes no longer viable. Now, these interventions, like the minimum wage, aren't happening in a vacuum. And if an industry can't support paying the cheapest possible labor an extra 3%, it's obviously on the road to death. And maybe hastening that demise is a good thing, but not if we haven't got a plan in place. And Max pointed out that much of the economic hardship in Aotearoa, New Zealand, can be attributed to the absence of a bridging plan when our manufacturing sector was dismantled between 88 and 95. He also points out that our vocational training system is poor, and this training infrastructure is the bridge we need to support failing industries. We're going to dive deeper into this stuff in an upcoming session, so stay tuned. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, all the other things. It's really good for this channel. And I look forward to seeing you in future episodes. Adios.